Good afternoon, everyone. Carosoft Technology would like to welcome you to our Appgate and Radiant Logic webinar, Transforming End-to-End Network Security, a deep dive into Zero Trust architecture and interoperability. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. The audio portion of this webinar can be heard through your computer speakers. All audio lines have been muted to reduce any background noise. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat pod at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer all of your questions at the end of the presentation. If for some reason we do not get to your questions, our team will certainly follow up with you offline. Just to tell you a little bit about Carosoft, we are a trusted government IT solutions provider delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, and local government agencies. Carosoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all of its vendors, including Adobe, open source, VMware, and more. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please do not hesitate to call or email us for any of your needs. This webinar is being recorded and a copy of the presentation will be emailed to you. We are pleased to offer one continuing professional education or CPE credit to those that attend today's webinar. In order to qualify for the credit, you must be actively listening and watching the webinar and answer the polling questions that will be presented throughout the presentation so we can monitor active attendance. For more information on the CPE credits we are offering, our CPE sponsor NASPA and submission process, please click the link on your screen. If you meet all of today's requirements, you will receive your certificate of completion within 2 weeks. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Joining us, we have Jonathan Roy, Principal Security Architect at Appgate, and Wade Ellery, Field CTO and Senior Evangelist at Radiant Logic. Jonathan and Wade, I'll pass it on to you. The floor is all yours.
Hi, again, this is Jonathan Roy. I'm the Principal Security Architect here at Appgate. Been with Appgate for about 4 or 5 years. Prior to that, spent a lot of time in the DoD as in the Army, doing a lot of IT, tactical communications, and really excited about walking you through our capability today. We're going to hear a lot about Zero Trust, identity and access management, onboarding, different types of users, coalition environments. You'll hear also some things about our tactical or disconnected capability. So working here with Radiant Logic as our alliance partner, we're excited to kind of go over the overarching suite of capabilities. I'll pass it to you, Wade.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Wade Ellery, Field CTO for Radiant Logic. I've been with the company for 11 years now. Spent quite a bit of time working with the DoD. And I'm really excited today about our capabilities. We're going to do a live demo of both products, so you'll get to see the real world interactivity of the two platforms and how we can solve some really today's challenges, both for access management and for a DDoS environment. It'll be very interesting to see this go forward. So back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. So we're have a quick agenda here, and hopefully there will be some questions that get posed throughout the presentation. We were going to go over like a joint capability so you understand how Appgate and Radiant Logic work together, the use cases that we're targeting on solving. So it's not about point products delivering, our intellectual property. It's about delivering mission capability to our DoD customers. I'll go through a few slides and you're going to see toward the end of that our live demonstration so you can kind of understand the user experience with Appgate, the administrative side as well. We're then going to drop into Radiant Logic. They're going to have a couple slides they're going to go through in a live demo, but the end of this is really kind of showing how these both of these platforms jointly deliver across the use cases that we're going to be describing. And again, looking forward to questions that we can answer throughout and toward the end of the webinar here. So at a really high level, I'm going to start off by kind of explaining what Appgate is. At a very high level, the easiest way to think about it is making sure the right user gets the appropriate amount of access to the right resource at the right time. If you think about that in its kind of the overarching zero trust architecture, identity is a critical piece to that. Holistically, Appgate uses identity, device information, and other environmentals, whether it's geographic location and risk score, but a lot of the times it does start with identity. So for us, understanding as much about the user as possible is critical to ensuring the right user gets the right amount of access. So in order for us to, achieve that goal across what's typically a very complicated environment, right? When you're thinking about identity, there could be multiple identity stores, identity providers for not only your, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, but all the coalition partners and mission partners out there that exist. So being able to authorize, authenticate those users and get them to participate in, information sharing repositories, conducting joint operations. That's what you're going to see in the demo today. So I'll start off with kind of explaining the Appgate piece, how we're, securely connecting these on-premise users or remote users, how we're tying into identity fabrics, how we deliver this at the enterprise level, meaning cloud environments and data centers, but also the tactical edge piece. And I will end my slides with, that overarching complexity, which is interoperability, where, other mission partners and coalition partners may be using other technologies. So how do we have a interoperability story when there's such a, wide, heterogeneous environment that we have to work within? So that's the Appgate piece, and I'll give it to Wade for the Radiant intro.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just to give you a general idea, as Jonathan said, the Radiant Logic is the source of identity data that feeds into Appgate. All the decisions that Appgate makes are based on information that it can collect from the edge, from the environment, but also information that Radiant Logic can provide about the identities of the users themselves. Everything comes down to authorization in a zero trust architecture, minimum amount of provisioning, large amount of authorization in near real time. Providing the right information at the right time in a scalable and highly configurable manner is what Radiant Logic does. And it's a really nice pairing with Appgate so that you get the right information authorized at the right time with the minimum amount of friction to the end user.
Yeah, perfect, Wade. Thank you. So the use cases that we're really going after or kind of, focused on for this webinar, again, both Radiant and Appgate have a broad suite of capabilities, but we really wanted to narrow down, again, not to point product, but to overarching capability. So challenges that we're trying to address is, rapidly being able to onboard, third parties, coalition partners, and mission partners in, ongoing DoD environments, while operating in these joint engagements, providing granular access control, again, back to right user, right time, enhancing the overall, security of the environment. So getting away from what normally is like a VPN style architecture where as long as you authenticated, you have access to an entire network or an entire enclave, and really getting down to what data elements, what applications specifically, and what permissions do you have in those environments, really getting it down to that level of granularity. As I mentioned earlier, interoperability is going to be a key piece to this, right? Where, other branches of service or coalition partners may be using completely different technology stacks. So how do I create this, information sharing or operational capability when I have to coexist with other solutions that even may directly compete with, both Appgate and Radiant? So solving for that challenge. And lastly is, a lot of technologies out there have a broad suite of capabilities, but the second you kind of put them into the DoD silo, you're really tasked with, operating in contested or disconnected environments. That could be something as simple as forward deployed flyaway kits. It could be ships as they go over the horizon, losing that overall network connectivity where you can't rely on, internet reach back to get, policy enforcement access to, authorized users. So how do you do any of these zero trust constructs in these disconnected environments? And that's what we'll be going over today. So to kind of level set really quickly here, and again, we only have about an hour, so I have to keep this brief, and hopefully this will spark your interest enough to have, follow-on engagement with our teams. What is Appgate? So Appgate, by definition, is a software-defined perimeter. We want to make sure, we understand as much about users and their identities and attributes as possible. So think about those roles and groups that they may belong to, combining that with the device telemetry, like, what's the STIG compliance state of their device, what processes are running, what applications are they running, where are they coming in from, what's the risk score of those users. And think about kind of taking all that telemetry in real time, continually monitoring it, and then making real-time decisions on what a user should or should not be able to access. On the far right, under number 3, there is a very high-level graphic of how we typically deploy our platform. You can think of those orange circles as virtual appliances that can live in your data centers, live in your cloud environments, live in your tactical edge flyaway kits. And the first thing that you'll notice is when a user connects into these environments, they're not sending any of their traffic to like an Appgate cloud. So in our vernacular, we call that being direct routed. So you as an organization maintain positive control of all your certificate material for creating secure connections, all of your configuration data, any of the, network traffic traversing through this zero trust platform stays within your security boundary. So it's not a trust plus one architecture, it's a zero trust. So again, you don't send any of your traffic outside of your security boundary. The other piece that you'll notice with Appgate, it's not like a normal VPN where you connect into one site. It's a one-to-many connection. And even though this looks like it's primarily for remote access, it's definitely targeted toward universal zero trust access. So that means whether you're on-premise, on-base, forward deployed, you should have the same zero trust principles applied to your access. One of the linchpins to our solution is keeping your protected resources and mission critical applications cloaked. Without getting too deep into the weeds, in essence, what we do is we have a way to allow users and operators to in essence operate in contested environments because we keep your applications and our platform itself undiscoverable from an adversary trying to go look for your resources and your users. So just think of if you can operate in contested environments because Appgate is cloaking you from being discoverable really on any network. And it's a huge value add to our DoD and coalition partners out there that are having to not fight in a sandbox, you're fighting in contested environments. So how do you do that securely? So this is a little bit deeper into what we mean by direct routed versus cloud routed. In essence, hold on, I got to pop up on my screen and minimize that. So in essence, direct routed versus cloud routed, you'll hear a lot about solutions that are providing zero trust capability. And I'd say about 99%, I'm hesitant to say 100, but 99% of those require that you have your traffic come down into, let's say, in like an Appgate cloud. And that would be this bottom capability here. Now, the reason why Appgate chooses not to take this approach is because it really hinders us to deliver kind of that third critical use case around being able to operate while disconnected. If I have to have my users connect to a cloud service or a SaaS service in order to connect to on-premise infrastructure or even cloud infrastructure, then if this network doesn't exist, there's really no means for me to enforce any of my policies, connect my users securely. And that's really kind of, one of the linchpins to our approach being up here at the direct routed model. Again, being able to operate while disconnected. The controller and the gateway, which from a zero trust perspective fall into like the policy decision point and policy enforcement point. They don't live in an Appgate cloud. They live in your boundary. That could be completely isolated in a flyaway kit. That could be deployed on a hyperconverged stack that's operating on a ship. It could be, in a air-gapped environment running on SIPR or some other higher level network like JWIC. So completely no need to call back over the internet to an Appgate cloud service really unlocks a lot of flexibility for our customer sets. I'll get on to the next slide here. So what makes Appgate different beyond, cloaking and beyond, this direct routed piece? We really heavily invest in this concept of a data-centric policy engine. So what you're going to see when I jump into my demo right now after this slide is going to be, well, how does Appgate really differentiate and get me to that end state of zero trust? How am I tying in identity information from Radiant Logic? Or maybe there's other solutions that I need telemetry from in order to make these real-time access decisions. So at a very high level, what I'm showing here is where we see a lot of our DoD partners moving toward. They're getting away from IP addresses. They're getting away from kind of that traditional means that you do access control using ACLs and firewall rules. So you're normally, when you're thinking about network access, you see here's a user, here's his IP address, and here's the tens or hundreds or even thousands of IPs or subnets that he's allowed to connect to. But again, that's very binary in nature, right? You have, a list of IP addresses, and it becomes really difficult to manage at scale. So what we do within the Appgate platform is really we want to take advantage of tags and labels that exist in the environment. So it could be something as simple as if you have workloads in AWS and you've labeled them as IL2, IL4, IL5, IL6, but you can kind of think of having different types of labels, right? You can have a label that says this application lives in IL5. It's also in production, and it's an HR application. So imagine being able to write rules around how these workloads are tagged and labeled that can then extend out to really any other technology that uses tags or labels as a construct. It could be a black box solution that, goes down to the data object level and is tagging and labeling different files and folders on an operating system. It could be a little bit higher level abstraction than that. So if you're thinking like SDN or SD-WAN, where there's tags and labels on different segments in the network. But the idea here is wherever there's tags or labels that exist in the platform, Appgate can use those to write security policy. Again, getting you away from millions of firewall rules down to something very dynamic. And one of our data ingress points, which we've kind of obviously talked about, is Radiant Logic, where not only can they hold identity data, but they can hold attributes about other elements in the environment. So being able to consume all of these different tags, labels, and metadata across all these different platforms gives you a really adaptive and a dynamic way to control access to not only applications, but actually down to the resources themselves. One of the things that we want to briefly talk about, and I'll probably end up coming back to this, is interoperability. Just because, one organization may choose to be using Appgate doesn't mean that Appgate is being used, across the entire DoD or every single mission partner. So we need a way to interoperate with other solutions. So we've spent a lot of development cycles on working with Radiant Logic to really solve for that challenge specifically. So the idea is really straightforward, where if I'm an organization and I've created, permissions on who should have access to my resources, but I need a third party or an external party to also have access to do some type of joint operation, but they're not using Appgate. So how do I control what they're accessing and having, some type of reciprocity between the two platforms? And that's what this green box in the center is delivering. So what we've done is we worked directly with Radiant Logic to provide what we're calling a master zero trust record. The idea really came from how identity objects are federated in a ICAM solution. So if you're familiar with ICAM, there's this construct called a master user record, where you may have multiple identity stores, but you're creating a virtual directory where all these identities can exist, and you can allow information sharing about identities across this master user record. So we took that same construct and applied it to zero trust access policies. So a simple example could be, if there's a third-party ZTNA provider out there, but you as an organization are using Appgate, you can publish what your policies are for users to access resources. So again, in Appgate, we have our own vernacular. We call things that you have access to entitlements. We define who has access with identity policies, and we define conditions of when you have access as an actual condition in our platform. And other platforms may have different terminology for that, right? So they may have allow rules or ID maps or access criteria. So you need something in the middle to do this real-time translation so that I can publish policy in Appgate and have it be enforced by a third-party solution. So if I have organization A is using Appgate, organization B is using another provider, I can still publish policy that's going to say, in order for you to have access to my resources, you need to enforce the following 16 elements, and I need to validate that those are being enforced, all the way throughout your stack. So it's a really interesting approach to solving for interoperability across, the zero trust access space. And again, this part of the presentation probably is about 2 hours on its own. So if there's any interest in, how can we work across different ZT providers, we're more than happy to kind of get into those details with a follow-on conversation. So now for the demo, I only have a few minutes left before I have to hand it over to Wade. What you're going to see is I have my user here in the middle. This is me, and I'm going to show you how I access resources. I'm going to log in with a simulated U.S. Air Force user by the name of Robin. She's going to get access to certain resources in my environment, and I'm going to use tags and labels to really drive my access. But the scenario that we want to walk you through is, let's say there is an exercise being conducted where we have to work with our Canadian coalition partners. And today, if they tried to sign into Appgate, they wouldn't have access to the resources because there's no connectivity between Appgate and the identities that live in that Canadian identity store. And that's where Radiant Logic is going to come in and solve that challenge of pulling in all these different identity sources, normalizing them and making them usable in Appgate, and me being able to not only authorize but authenticate those users and grant the appropriate amount of access in real time. So I'm going to now pop out of the presentation here, and I'm going to go into the Appgate environment. So what you're going to see right now is I'm going to bring up my Appgate software, and just keep in mind, I'm going to be showing the Appgate full client right now. Now we do have two different flavors of Appgate primarily. We have a full client and we have clientless. So I'm definitely going to focus on the full client for this demonstration, but just keep in the back of your mind that we have a fully clientless capability. So right now I want to sign in to the environment and be granted access to certain resources. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And what I'm actually doing is I'm targeting a Radiant Logic endpoint that has all the identity data that I'm going to be leveraging to authenticate my users. And this is where we could be prompting the user for, a CAT card, some type of token. In this demo, I'm just simply doing a username and password, but any type of multi-factor or strong authentication that you'd like to use, this is where we could do that interaction. So what happened there is I've signed in, and on the Appgate agent, you're going to take note that I've now connected to the Appgate platform and is deciding what resources I should be able to see. You'll take note here that there's some shortcuts that have been made available to me to connect to some resources. And then I also have connected to multiple sites here. So again, Appgate isn't just a one-to-one connection. You can see I'm connected to an AWS environment, a physical data center, a tactical edge node, and a simulated US Air Force environment. Now that's great that I've shown you the connectivity, but what does it look like from the administration perspective and what this user Robin has access to? And then again, the end of this demo is going to be me trying to sign in with the Canadian identity. And initially, I'm not going to be able to have access to anything until Wade, joins them through Radiant Logic and brings them into the identity fabric for me to use it. But in this first step, right, I'm actually able to sign in, and I just want to quickly show what Appgate's learned about this user and what's going on with the device itself. So to keep it pretty simple, here's some identity information that we're pulling in from Appgate and also Radiant Logic, as you can see here. We're going to start with something as simple as groups. So we're pulling in group information about this user, things like branch of service, things like clearance data. So it doesn't just have to be things that live in Active Directory. If we want to pull in through Radiant things out of JPass or DIS or some type of other repository, those can be made available to Appgate via Radiant Logic. Other information like, duty station, was their IA training completed, how many devices they have, the current risk score for the user, but just all of these things that we're learning, we can use in policy. So an example policy could be, I want to say anybody that's signed in using Radiant Logic, if you belong to the red group and you've completed your IA training, I'm going to grant you access to a resource. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about identity and devices because, again, we're learning about the device information as well. So if I want to check for stick compliance, all of these things can be used in policy, but I kind of want to show you the real-time nature of the platform. So again, I don't have time to go through all of the different UI elements within Appgate. I have to kind of jump to the end result. So a really easy way to understand the tagging and labeling and getting you down to a real zero trust architecture is really seeing tags and labels in action. So I have in my demonstration environment, I built a web server that's hosting a Databricks application. And so you can understand how Appgate's going to use tags and labels to drive my access. You're going to see that here. So if you're familiar with cloud environments, it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to click this resource and I'm going to look at the IP address for that application. And one of the other things I want to look at is how this application is tagged. So in Appgate, what I've done is I've built a policy that said, if I'm part of the red group, I have access to any resource that's going to be tagged Databricks. So what that results in is I'm going to be able to ping this workload by its IP address. And you can see here, I'm going through and pinging this workload. I'll zoom in. And well, that's great that I can ping the workload, but I want to show how real time the policy is for the tag or label changing on this workload. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into this workload, leave this ping running over here on the right, and I want to change the tag of this workload from Databricks to something else. Let's, assume that this workload has moved from production to development as an example. So I'm going to come up to change the tag for this resource. Let me find it again. Here's Databricks, and we go to tags. I'm going to manage the tag. I'm going to change it from Databricks to Dev Databricks. So again, my policy is only qualifying me if the workload is tagged Databricks, but I'm going to move it out of production and put it into the development zone. So I've changed this tag in the AWS environment. So now on the back end, APIs are firing between Appgate and Radiant Logic and Appgate and AWS. And if you now notice that the policy is now no longer in alignment. So as the tags and labels change in Appgate, or if the tag or label changes on your data object, you have real-time access change in our platform. So you have to extrapolate that out just a little bit. Remember all the other policy objects I showed you with the identity, right? So if my group changed from red to blue, or if my location changed, any of the things that Appgate's learning about the user, the device, maybe for some reason my risk score has gone from a 25 to a 75, any of those elements change, this is what you're going to, get from a connectivity perspective, where we are going to adaptively and dynamically, adjust the user's access based on what we're learning. And again, that was just a really simple, a tag changed on a piece of data. But now I have to get into, we want to onboard a brand new user from Canada, right? So I'm going to go ahead and sign out of Appgate, and we're going to simulate a Canadian user who wants access to resources. And initially, I shouldn't have access. So we're going to come in and we're going to sign in as Helen, who's part of the Canadian Armed Forces here. And I'm going to attempt to sign in. And right now, her identity doesn't exist in the platform. So now this is where the power of Radiant Logic is going to come in. They're going to be able to go out and, add that identity store for Canada into their fabric, which will then make it available to sign these users into Appgate and then get them access to to resources that they should have access to, right? Again, whether it's by IP address, tag or label, etc. So Wade, if you don't mind, could you solve my problem of not getting Helen to get signed in, please?
Definitely. You want me to do that right now, or you want me to step?
Oh, no, I would love to kind of explain Radiant, and then toward the end, if we can just run to that.
Yeah, I'll definitely turn her on at the end of this. So appreciate the coverage there, Jonathan. And let me go ahead and just expand on a little bit of what Jonathan had to talk about so far, with just a little bit more information from Radiant Logic, and then a quick demo of what the backend looks like and how we're providing all that data. Now, one of the things that Jonathan mentioned was all that attribute information that was being made available by Radiant Logic. The challenge, though, for our customers is that attribute data, all your infrastructure around identity data, is not sitting in one place. It is normally scattered in multiple data sources. As mentioned, it could be in a training platform. It could be in a compliance or security platform. It can be in your Active Directory. It could be sitting in a cloud platform, sitting up in Azure AD or in Okta. So that information is in disparate places, but it's also not in formats that are easily used simultaneously. And it becomes a real challenge for applications to try and map back to all the places that data exists and then try to correlate that user back into a single identity set. So what Radiant Logic is built to do is do that heavy lifting on behalf of all the applications that need to consume that data. We're going to connect to the backend systems. We're going to abstract the identity information from its sources. We're not going to disrupt those sources. We're not asking the owners of that data to do anything different than give us access. Then we'll let you model that information. You get to decide what identity information, what attributes, what sets of users are exposed in what we call a view. And the view is what the application consumes. What Jonathan was attaching to earlier was a view in Radiant Logic that we'll see in a moment. And that's the subset of data in exactly the format, the schema, the structure, and the protocol that he's looking for. And then we publish that view and make it available to the applications that need it. And as mentioned, in a tactical DDoS environment, you need to be able to put that information on a mobile platform. You need to be able to put it on an aircraft carrier, or you need to be able to put it in a helicopter and send it out into the field and disconnect it from the sources of truth, but still let that data operate. And Radiant Logic is architected for that very function. And then when you come back into connected range with your sources of truth and with your master user record in the primary data set, that tactical model will reconnect and be able to push back any of the changes that were made in the field to the primary record if you want to authorize those updates to take place. So not only can you take your data with you, but when you're operating on that data in a disconnected model, you still have control over that information and a way to access it. So just to give you a kind of a view of what Radiant Logic looks like here, if you look at all the sources of identity data across the bottom, and it used to be a world that was basically Active Directory and databases, maybe some LDAP directories, but there are so many places now that identity data is housed. HR systems, cloud-based IDaaS platforms like Okta and Azure, IGA platforms like SailPoint and Saviynt are now sources of identity, API endpoints, and all the SCIM interfaces that give us this information that we want to correlate together. And then we seed and feed that information up into all the consumers of that identity data. So you can see that it's not just the access management layer, but it's the governance platform, it's the PAM platforms, it's the data access systems that are consuming this identity data to make decisions. In a zero trust architecture, everything is about the right access to the right resource at the right time, made on evaluating a policy in the moment based on all the identity information you can gather. And making that information highly scalable and available is what Radiant Logic does. This is an outline of the DoD's trust capacity execution roadmap. What they are talking about is all the different functions in a zero trust environment that contribute to this overall experience, from the user all the way through the network, all the way through to the edge. The blue areas are areas that Radiant Logic directly impacts. The green areas are ones that we influence, that we supply identity data to, that we provide information and data and backup quality to that data set so that those applications and those functions can actually be using real-time information that's available in the environment to make the right decisions at the right time. So you'll see the need and the consumption of identity data spans the whole zero trust architecture. And in that simple model against identity, endpoints, data, apps, infrastructure, and network, all of these are policy engines. Like Appgate is showing you right now as a software-defined perimeter. This is a policy engine that has a set of rules that are evaluated to grant access. Each of these policy engines here has the need for a policy information point. And that policy information point is what Radiant Logic provides. We are the bridge from all the disparate identity data through to the policy enforcement points, the policy decision points, and equally important, the policy authoring points. You want to author your data, your policies with the same data, the same syntax, the same information that you're going to evaluate that data on so that you have consistency against policy and authoring. We give you the ability now, as we mentioned, to model this data in multiple different forms and structures. I may have requirements in different endpoints, different policy engines, different access control platforms for data in a different way. I may need a flat list. I may need a hierarchical list. I may need a list that's sorted by title or department or region or location so I can map and model this data. It's build it once, use it many, many times across the organization. And as you can see, again, a myriad of identity sources combine to build that rich aggregated record that Appgate was using to be able to look at the clearance level for the particular user gaining access, to look at the training information, to look at the red and blue authorizations they had against data sets. All that information can be correlated together without disrupting these back-end platforms, without asking these systems to make any changes, without disruption, and at scale so that you authenticate and authorize the user without introducing any additional friction. As with any security platform, if you make it hard for the user, if you add in latency to the system, it's going to cause problems. People are going to want it removed. The business has to operate. The DoD has to be able to do their job in the field. You can't slow things down, but you need now to be able to offer much more security. And the combination of Appgate and Radiant Logic is that solution. The policy information point on the top and the ability for Radiant Logic to feed that information. This is a quick animation here of building out the environment. So I have multiple sources of identity data. I'm correlating that in Radiant Logic. I'm building my global profile that's feeding into Appgate. I can also build groups dynamically based on attribute values. So if I still have applications that are authorizing around group membership, or that makes it easier, I can build those group authorizations. Those then can be pushed out to the decision point at the Appgate level, and based on that information, authorize access to that resource. Or if my training is not current on Workday, and that's a policy piece that needs to be enforced to get access to Workday, I don't get that access. On top of that, if I need to synchronize this data now into another endpoint, I have another IDaaS platform out there that needs this attributes aggregated together, or potentially needs that dynamic group information to make authorized decisions. This is another way we can use and leverage this information. So it has many facets in which it can be adopted. So let me go ahead and step out of this and step quickly into Radiant itself and give you a view of what we have here in the application. And I got to make sure I get the right one of these spun up. Let's see. That's not the one I want. No, hold on. My apologies. I've got so many screens open here. Okay. So this is an environment for Radiant Logic. What we have done here is we've built a model of multiple identity stores together. Nope. Come on, load the right screen. There we go. My mouse is not cooperating. And I just, okay. I'm going to step out of this environment because it's not acting the way I want it to. And we step into another one. I got many here, so we're good. Don't worry. So this is this is an example of building that global profile that Jonathan was showing you previously. This comes from multiple identity sources. So the system is built on the concept that we're going to recognize identity data coming from potentially multiple untrusted AD environments, multiple HR platforms, which are very common in large, complex organizations. I've got a electronic data record management system, a clearance system, and a risk management engine here. All these are contributors to my identity data. Now, when I'm building this together, I have the capabilities of doing mappings here. I have a set of attributes that belongs to my source of identity data that I'm building into my profile. And then I have a set of identity data that is the correlation of all the attributes from all the sources that I will be exposing to my consuming applications like Appgate. So here from the Active Directory, I'm mapping in certain information that is relevant and that maps to that data. But you can see other information here that would be coming from other sources as that is correlated together. So I get this rich master record built up. And in the combination of this, I get to do a correlation logic that says, if I have a user in a source that I am correlating to my master record, and the employee ID number on that master record matches the employee ID number on that source, and the city in my master record matches the location on that source, and my EDIPI on the master record matches my employee number again, and my first name matches my given name, I'm going to say that's the same person. So I'm then able to link that account together across the system to make sure that that user gets added to the proper record. I'm building a union here. I'm attaching to this profile all the identity data. So I end up with a combination across all of these users of 6 sources of identity data merged into a converged record here. You can see things like references to data tag reviewer, cats and dogs and animals. I think a little further down, I'll see the red and the blue that you saw earlier. You can see this particular user has some training that needs to be done. That's going to affect their access in the system. So what I've done here is I've created a model that lets me bring all that identity data together. Now, if I want to look at that in a more correlated model, I can come into the Global Identity Viewer and look at Adam Kennedy's record and see in the global profile here a set of data that is correlated against his profile, includes his location, some exposed data here, but I can also see the components that make up his profile. He has data coming from Active Directory, data coming from the HR system in the UK, and again, his data from his records management platform, his clearance information, and an aggregated risk scoring here. I can bring in risk scores from multiple risk engines. I may have a behavioral risk scoring platform. I may have a break glass enterprise big red button that turns everything off risk score. I may have one based on environmental information coming in from edges. And I can build those into composite risk scores that I can then use to evaluate the access for that particular user. So as Jonathan mentioned earlier, we have a profile now created for Appgate that is actually consuming the identity data coming out of Radiant Logic. Let me go back into that profile here. And then I'll bring up that particular record. You can see now, as I log into Radiant Logic, I have in the directory browser a view called Appgate view, which is how I've decided to expose the identity data that I've made available to Appgate. Now, if I look in the users under the user OU here, which is the US Forces users, I can see in each individual profile, again, that very rich set of identity data that I've correlated across all those sources, and all that information is formatted and available in one place for Appgate to consume. But if I look at the coalition partner right now, I'll see that there's no identities in the coalition partner. I am going to do a joint exercise with that partner. I staged the environment to be able to accept that data, all I need to do now is connect Radiant Logic to that source of data. It may be an Active Directory in Canada. It may be a Radiant Logic instance in Canada. It may be some other source of identity data in Canada that I can connect to and read data from, and that I can process authorization back through. And by simply going into the back end and turning on that particular function, so I can look here at my Appgate view, and as it populates out, I'll see that I have 3 different sources. One's the coalition partner. I simply enable that coalition partner, which says to Radiant Logic, you can now communicate with that backend. You can now pass information through from that backend. So the exercise is started. We're all working together as a team. When I'm done, I can deactivate this partner, and that access will again disappear. So what I'm going to do now is turn this over to Jonathan again so he can show you what looks like for authorizing that user once that we have gone ahead and enabled that back end. It's as simple as that to bring in additional constituents to your environment and be able to provide them the information they need for their access.
Yeah, thank you, Wade. So we left off with me failing to sign in with that Canadian user. So we're going to go ahead and create a policy that's going to grant access for this user. So in Appgate, it's pretty simple to put together a policy. It's really combined of 2 elements. The first is really defining what the user has access to. So for example, let's say we're going to do the joint operation for Orange, and we're going to grant access to the Orange information sharing application. That's the name of it. We'll go ahead and copy this name. And we have to decide what they have access to. So we could say earlier, like, we can do things like, here's the IP address space that they're going to have access to. I also made mention that we don't only want to just focus on IP addresses. We can do things like application names. So let's say orange.sharepoint.mil. And the data tagging element, that could be, we can also say, hey, if anything in AWS, if you remember earlier, I said Databricks. This is how it would look in the Appgate UI. So this is 3 examples of how we could define what a user has access to, whether it's an IP space, an application name, or if it's tagged a certain way in a platform. And again, this could be not just AWS, it can be a number of different platforms. And we're going to allow a certain type of connectivity, whether that's, TCP 443 as an example to view a web page. So that's as simple as it can be to create what this user, Helen, will have access to. And maybe we want to add some additional conditions. So those conditions in Appgate, there's a number of different things that we're going to do. We're going to maybe, if we cared about it, we could check for, they must be STIG compliant in order to be granted access to this resource. Some other criteria could be, we're going to query Radiant Logic on the back end if they've completed their IA training. So that's going to be a condition for access. We also may care about risk score being under a 75. So this is the very simple way that we've added conditions to what this user should have access to. But now we need to take this and add it to, an identity. So we've created this thing called Orange Information Sharing Application, but we have to tie the what to the who, and that's where policy comes in. So if I wanted to create a policy for this exercise, so we're going to do the Orange application access policy. This is where we're going to link the what, which was the name of the application set. And then we're going to assign it to certain groups of users. So the nice thing is we're going to be pointing to Radiant Logic as our source of truth. But within Radiant Logic, we're going to be able to identify certain things like groups. So we're going to come in here and say if you're part of the Orange group, as an example, just to keep it simple. But I want to just highlight there's so many options that you have to decide what types of users get access to this type of resource. Again, we're just simply saying if they authorize with Radiant Logic and use their strong authentication and they're matching on a certain group. And again, we can get as granular as we like to decide who has access, but this is just a really simple policy that's then going to grant my user Helen access to the resources. So now what I should be able to do is when I sign into Appgate, I'm going to be prompted to authorize and authenticate. And now that Wade has enabled that join through activating that coalition partner identity store as a valid source, this time, now that it's an active source for Radiant Logic, that now populates and allows me to connect via Appgate. So this is kind of where it's nice to have two different options where the coalition partner may not have the full client. They may not want to install the Appgate software. So we do have a completely clientless solution as well. So as long as they have a browser, we can select Radiant Logic as a dropdown as an example, and then grant that user access to certain resources. So whether you have a coalition partner that's willing to install the software from Appgate, or if they don't want to install that software and they just want to log in through a browser, they can have that, that same user experience. This is kind of the final slide here of kind of just summarizing what you've seen today from the Appgate and Radiant side. We're taking identity data, we're taking the device data, we're taking the telemetry about the user and making these real-time access decisions, much like Wade showed. We've also kind of jointly done a mapping on kind of where Appgate fits as far as the DoD Zero Trust pillars. So to keep it pretty simple, black means it's a fully covered operational capability, and orange is kind of highlighting that we're enhancing that existing kind of framework. So whether it's looking for conditional access, looking for multi-factor, looking for device compliance, looking for, logging all traffic, or, micro or macro segmentation, Appgate is delivering these pieces, and we have much more than just this high-level mapping. So if there's interest in seeing, test procedures for each of the 90 target state controls and, the 60 or so future state controls, we have all of that well documented. So that's really Appgate and Radiant Logic presentation. And I'll just hand it back over to the Carahsoft team to see if there's any questions that haven't been answered yet. And thank you.
Thank you both. It is now time for our Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A pod. And it looks like we have a few questions in the pod already. Our first question is, what does Appgate SDP replace?
So from a replacement perspective, normally VPN style solutions is what we're replacing. Also kind of network access control. So if you're thinking about if you're on premise and you're trying to control what users have access to, or if you're remote, what users have access to, it's really about any type of those technologies that you may be leveraging today to grant the right user the right amount of access at the right time. But in some scenarios, it's not always going to be rip and replace, where we realize that you're going to do, when you take on Zero Trust and you're moving from a kind of more legacy approach, which is, okay, this user authenticated, I'm going to grant them access to my entire production network, or this user connected with their VPN, I'm going to grant you access to all of a certain site or all of a certain subnet. We have to do a lot of work we've already done a lot of work to be interoperable in those environments. But traditionally speaking, it's normally network access control, it's normally VPN. And I would say also there's typically a pretty significant reduction in the need for WAN connectivity between different resources. A lot of that comes from, if you think about the Appgate architecture, we're not, creating this connection from you as a user to one site in your enterprise. So let's say you had 50 sites. Before Appgate, it's probably common for you to have users connect into one of your core data centers. And if they need to get to data center number 7 or 8, they're typically having to go over the WAN or SD-WAN kind of back-end routing to get there. With Appgate, it's a one-to-many connection. So there's a Appgate point of presence typically at every location. So a lot of your WAN traffic gets reduced because your users are going directly to the resources they need access to in the most performant way possible. So we get rid of a lot of that hairpinning. So we've done a lot of that in practice in the DoD, where a lot of our customers are used to using like a JRSS VPN. So the Air Force, as an example, they have, Platform One and Cloud One, and prior to Appgate, you'd have to turn on your JRSS VPN, go through a DISA IAP, go through the JRSS security stack, bounce around the DODN, find a cloud access point or a BCAP to get you to Cloud One or some other kind of cloud offering. So if you think about it, it's like 10 to 15 hops just for you to get to a single cloud, where in Appgate it's 1-to-1. So you directly connect to that cloud over the dirty internet, but simultaneously you would have connections to data center 1 through 20 at the same time. So that's the long answer. I apologize, but it's typically NAC and VPN and WAN reduction are our areas of focus.
Thanks, John. Our next question is there a limit to the types of identity sources that can be added to the master user record?
There's not really a limit. We are platform agnostic, schema agnostic, and standards based. So we will talk to and share information from any source that will talk a standard protocol. It may be a flat file. It may be something that's a simple CSV file, a well-documented API. Workday is an example of a well-documented API if you've seen their work. Or any kind of SCIM2 interface that is well implemented, and then regular old LDAP, JDBC, Active Directory. So we find a lot of identity data scattered across a number of sources, and it gives us the capability of really casting a broad net, which makes a richer profile, which gives you more granularity in your authorization, which is Jonathan can attest to. The more you can get granular in the way you can build your policies, the more choices you have, the more effectively you can protect resources, and the more you can make the decisions and definitively decide levels of access within a platform. So there's not really a limitation to that. And the nice thing about Radiant is this is not a scenario where you have to build all this up front and plan ahead. It's a very flexible platform. You can add additional sources of identity down the road. You can expand the schema. You can build and enhance your master user record. You can filter the data that you share. So you can adapt very easily to the changing profiles of the needs for the identity data itself.
Thank you, Wade.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is, how does Radiant Logic handle the different attribute schemas?
So this is one of the nice things about the product is that you think of it almost as a sandbox where you bring the identity information in, and traditionally an LDAP infrastructure, an AD infrastructure has a defined schema. But your organization you're working with may have extended that schema. They may have added additional information. They may have put things in car license because they just didn't have any place else to put it. But if you look at databases don't have a structured schema. So what we do, first of all, is we extract the schema from the source itself with extended attributes if that's applicable. Or if it's a database, we will look at the row and column information and build a schema off of that actually the way it is structured. So you'll have an equivalent to an LDAP schema generated off of a flat file or an API backend or a database structure. And then once you have this common LDAP kind of schema model, we can let you decide what attributes are the same with different labels and you want to join them together into a multi-valued attribute. What attributes are common information across different platforms used to link profiles together. So you've got some very nice graphical tools within the product. This is all mouse driven. It's not a configuration product where you're coding all this in Java. You're actually doing this with a mouse. Everything that you saw that I put up today was done very quickly by basically using our tool set to build the constructs of that identity data, and then map the information, filter the information, transform it, apply logical data to that, and then publish it out in multiple different simultaneous views so that each consumer gets exactly what they need based on the sources of data you're sharing and how you want to make that data available.
Awesome. Thanks, Wade.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Our next question is Appgate serving policy to an enforcement point, Or is Appgate a PEP providing pass-through network access like a very dynamic firewall?
Yeah, so Appgate inherently is a policy decision point. It is its own policy enforcement point. So those two constructs are policy decision is held in our controller. It's just a virtual appliance. We typically separate the enforcement. So we want to normally have a separate virtual appliance for the control plane and a separate one for the data plane being our gateway. So the gateway is our policy enforcement point. Now, we don't want to operate Appgate independent of other policy decision points. So as an example, it's very common for us to get PDP information from other PDPs, right? So think of Appgate as a integration engine where, again, you may have policy authoring and policy information points we're pulling telemetry from, but there may be other tools that do policy decision that we need to get information from. So an example of that could be whether it's Microsoft Intune or McAfee or Carbon Black or really any number of tools. I'd say 99% of those all have API endpoints. And as part of the decision to grant access to a resource, much like we talked to Radiant Logic for the identity authorization and authentication, we can talk in real time to those other tools as well. So that's just probably the simplest way to think about it. So yes, Appgate is its own policy decision point. It has gateways, which are policy enforcement points, but it's very common for us to get other decision and information point information external to our platform.
Thanks, John. Looks like that's all the time we have for our Q&A today. Thank you, Jonathan and Wade. And I want to thank all of our participants as well as our speakers for being with us today. We hope our webinar has been helpful for you in your organization.